My name is Adrienne Vance. I'm 33 years old and I keep fragile newborn babies alive for a living teen. Last February, sitting at my mother's polished mahogany dining table, my family gathered to announce my brother Julian's 5th child. And then, without missing a beat, they announced what they had decided to do with the rest of my life. My mother looked right at me, smiled, and said I didn't really have a real life anyway. Everyone kept eating, passing the bread basket like my future was just a side dish someone had already carved up and served. None of them knew about the locked folder sitting in my phone. We were 3 weeks away from a choice that would change everything. What my mother did after I finally showed them, after the entire dining room fell dead silent, is the part I still hear late at night, because the phone wasn't the ending, it was only the match. Welcome back to their secret stories, where quiet women finally say the things families pretend not to hear. If you've ever been the one everybody leans on, but nobody actually sees, this story is for you. Drop a comment telling me what city and time you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe, because the ending of this one is worth staying for. Now, let me take you back to a Sunday about 3 months before that dinner, so you can see exactly what my family believed I was for. A typical Sunday at my parents' house in the historic outskirts of Boston went exactly like this. I drove the 20 minutes from my drafty apartment in Weymouth with a warm dish of sweet potato gratin on the passenger seat. My mother had called on Thursday and said, "You'll bring the gratin, Adrienne. You make it so well." I stood at the kitchen sink peeling root vegetables while my sister-in-law, Clara, rested her eyes on the living room recliner. I set the table. I tightened the loose brass banister on the front steps because my father, Arthur, had mentioned it twice without looking at me, which, in Vance family code, is an official work order. I kept one eye on Toby, who was 4, and one eye on Maeve, who was 2, while their parents scrolled through their phones. Meanwhile, my mother gave Aunt Martha the grand tour of my brother Julian's recent promotion at the logistics firm. Julian got a celebratory toast. Clara got endless sympathy for her exhaustion. I got asked whether I'd had a chance to look at the dripping utility sink in the basement yet. I want to be clear I wasn't sulking in the corner. I laughed at the jokes. I sliced the pie. I loved those kids so deeply it actually embarrassed me. But somewhere between drying the heavy roasting pan and changing a diaper no one else wanted to touch, I understood my role the way you understand the weather. I was the appliance of that house. Reliable, plugged in, but never consulted. That specific Sunday, we were clearing the dinner plates when my mother looked around and asked if anyone had seen the silver ladle, and 4 grown adults turned to look at me at the exact same time, as if I were the household lost and found. It was almost comical. Then everyone grabbed their coats. My mother packed up containers of leftovers for Julian's family, for Aunt Martha, and for the neighbor down the street. There was no plate left for me. Nobody had noticed I never actually sat down to eat. But I noticed that they didn't notice. I always noticed. If you want to understand how I inherited that role, you have to meet my grandmother, EVELYN. When I was 26, her heart began to fail, a slow and cruel decline. The family held an emergency meeting at my parents' kitchen table that lasted exactly 11 minutes. Julian had 2 toddlers and a mortgage. My mother said her knees were too bad to handle the stairs. My father nodded and agreed with whatever my mother said, and then every single face in the room turned to me with the same warm, terrible confidence. My mother uttered the sentence that would dictate my life for the next 4 years. "Well, you're the nurse." So I became the nurse. 4 years of evenings and weekends spent in EVELYN's cramped little cottage on Elm Street. Organizing pill trays, giving sponge baths, managing 2 ambulance rides at 3 in the morning. I spent one entire Christmas Eve in a crowded emergency room hallway holding her frail hand while my family sent group texts asking if I could still make it early to prep the roast. I was working exhausting 12-hour shifts in the neonatal intensive care unit and then driving straight to Elm Street to pull a second unpaid shift. My mother handled what she called the logistics, which meant making phone calls, which meant giving instructions, which meant managing me. EVELYN passed away 3 years ago at 87, her hand resting in mine. At her funeral, the minister stood at the pulpit and praised my mother's selfless devotion to family care. My mother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepted the compliments. I stood in the second row, wearing the sensible leather shoes EVELYN had bought me, and I learned a fundamental truth about how credit travels in my family. It always flows uphill. Here is what I will say for now because it matters later. Grandmother EVELYN left me something. It wasn't money. The little she had been swallowed up by roof repairs years ago. It was something else. I'll get to it, I promise. Because it is the sole reason there was a hidden folder on my phone in the first place. After EVELYN passed, the family immediately found me a new job without ever posting a listing. Julian and Clara lived 10 minutes away from me with 4 kids and a chaotic schedule held together by sheer luck. I became the glue. A midnight fever. Call Aunt Adrienne, she's a nurse. Clara is stuck at the dentist. Aunt Adrienne can pick up Leo from soccer practice. Anniversary weekend. Aunt Adrienne will watch all 4. She is so wonderful with them. And here is the complicated part, the part that kept the entire machine running. I genuinely, deeply loved those children. Leo, 9, who drew detailed comic books and narrated his drawing panels out loud like a voice actor. Toby, 4, who gave hugs with dizzy spins and breathless laughs. Maeve, 2, a tiny monkey who climbed everything. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was 7. And she was mine in some quiet, protective way I can't explain biologically. She was the only person in that entire family who ever asked me questions about myself. What do you like to do, Aunt Adrienne? What's your favorite sea creature? Do nurses ever get scared? I would have stepped in front of a train for that little girl, and everyone in the family knew it, and that was precisely the trap. Love is an incredibly convenient rope to tie someone up with, because they will happily hold the knot for you. I had tried setting boundaries. For the record, 2 years ago, I told them I could no longer do overnight babysitting on weeknights because I was working consecutive 12-hour shifts. That boundary lasted until the very next stomach bug swept through their house. When I tried to hold my ground, I didn't get a loud argument. I got a heavy sigh, a disappointed look, and my mother on the phone telling me I had become difficult. That was followed by 3 weeks of being lovingly punished with absolute silence, until I finally patched things over by volunteering to host Thanksgiving. I thought I understood the emotional math of my family by then. I thought I knew every possible way they could spend me. I was wrong. They were about to find an entirely new currency. Let me show you the 2 halves of my life back to back. One cold Tuesday in October at 4 in the morning, I was standing over a high-tech incubator with a baby girl born at 25 weeks. She weighed 1 pound, 12 ounces, a fragile human being smaller than a bag of flour. Her oxygen levels suddenly plummeted, and the room became incredibly quiet and incredibly fast all at once. For about 90 seconds, my hands and my years of training were the only barrier between that child and the dark. We got her back. Her father, a burly man in a sterile paper gown, wept openly on my shoulder. Her mother held my wrist tightly and whispered, "You're a lifesaver. Does your family know what you do?" I just smiled and offered a modest response. 12 hours later, I was at my parents' house because my mother needed help moving her heavy crystal stemware before the holidays. When I finally finished, I mentioned I was completely exhausted and wanted to head home. My mother simply waved a dish towel at me, cheerful as a church hymn, and said, "Oh, stay and finish the iron pans, sweetie. It's not like you have anything to rush home to." I stood there with my hands submerged in cooling gray dishwater and did the calculations that no one else in that kitchen ever bothered to do. Strangers in a sterile hospital corridor thought I was a miracle. The woman who raised me thought I was just a free hour with legs. That is the reality of being useful. And if you've lived it, you already know. Useful is invisible. A desk lamp is useful. Nobody ever asks the lamp how its day was. I dried the pans, drove home, and sat in my car in the dark outside my building for a very long time. 3 weeks later, the family group chat exploded, and everything I am about to tell you began. It was a Tuesday in the middle of November when my phone lit up on the break room table like a slot machine. The Vance family group chat, 31 messages in 4 minutes. At the top was an ultrasound image, grainy, gray, and unmistakable. Underneath, "Julian Hound 5, baby!" accompanied by a dozen exclamation points. Clara followed up with a heart emoji and a post she had shared on her social media page. Heaven sent one more. Aunt Martha sent virtual flowers. My father sent a thumbs up emoji, which for Arthur Vance is practically a love letter. I stood there in my scrubs, my coffee growing cold, and felt a real, honest wave of gladness first. I love babies. I have spent over a decade learning how to keep the smallest ones breathing. A new niece or nephew is never a tragedy to me, and Julian sounded genuinely happy. I typed out my congratulations with all my heart. I want that on the record. Whatever you think of me by the end of this story, know that I loved that unborn baby before anyone had even measured me for a cage. I had just slid the phone back into my pocket when it buzzed again. Not the group chat this time, a private call from my mother. That alone was unusual. My mother typically communicates by summons, usually routed through whoever happens to be standing next to her. When I answered, her voice had a brilliant shine to it that I hadn't heard in years. The specific tone she gets around weddings and funerals, the major occasions where she gets to direct the room. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said. Before I could answer, she dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to talk about the plan, sweetheart." I remember staring at my own reflection in the dark glass of the break room window. "Plan?" I asked. Nobody invited me to a meeting with a plan in it. "What plan, Mom?" She laughed, light as frosting, and said we would talk on Sunday. Then she hung up, leaving me standing there with a cold feeling in my stomach that I couldn't yet name. My body knew before my mind did. Sunday arrived, and I found out exactly what that shine in her voice was made of. My mother laid it out at her kitchen counter while she frosted a lavender, iced bundt cake, as casual as a local weather report. Clara would be completely overwhelmed by summer with a newborn and 4 other kids. Daycare for that entire crowd would cost more than Julian made in a month, she said, which was true. I agreed with her, which was my first mistake. In my family, agreement is treated as a signature on a contract. Then she got to the core of it. "So we've been thinking you could go part-time at the clinic, or just step away from nursing entirely for a while. Honestly, stepping away is much cleaner. The kids need consistency." She smoothed the lavender frosting flat. "Family takes care of family, Adrienne." I set down my coffee mug and spoke plainly, calmly, the way you would state your name in a court of law. "No, Mom. I have a career. I love my job. I am not quitting to be a full-time nanny. And here is the crucial detail I need you to understand. My mother did not argue with me. Arguing would have required her to acknowledge that she had heard me. She simply smiled at the cake, tapped her spatula twice on the edge of the bowl, and said, "Well, we'll work out the details later." It was as if I had raised a minor, insignificant concern about parking. My father wandered into the kitchen, took a swipe of frosting with his finger, and said with genuine admiration, "Your mother has got it all mapped out." I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, replaying the conversation. I had said no in clear English, and it had passed right through her like wind through a screen door. What terrified me wasn't that she had ignored me. It was how completely relaxed she had been. My mother is never relaxed unless she is already entirely certain she has won. I couldn't figure out where that certainty was coming from. I found out soon enough. That night, back in my apartment, I did what I had done almost every night for months. I opened my laptop, went to my email inbox, and refreshed it the way some people say a quiet prayer before bed. Here is what absolutely nobody in my family knew. 10 months earlier, in January, I had worked the most devastating shift of my career. We lost a 24-week preemie at 5 in the morning, and I had wept privately in the supply closet. When I finally came home, exhausted and grieving, I found a voicemail from my mother asking me to make 4 dozen mini quiches for a church garden club event. "Since you're off on Thursday anyway." Something in me went incredibly still that night. Not broken, focused. I sat down on my sofa, still wearing my heavy winter coat, and completed an application I had bookmarked for over a year, but had never allowed myself to finish. It was for a pediatric resuscitation fellowship attached to a major children's hospital in Edinburgh, Scotland. A 2-year contract teaching advanced training to neonatal nurses and midwives, doing the very thing I do best in this world, keeping impossibly small people alive. I had first learned about the program at a medical conference in Chicago from a silver-haired Scottish physician named Dr. Alastair Fraser. He had watched me run a high-intensity simulation and said, "You teach with your hands. Have you ever considered doing this on purpose?" I had completed 2 video interviews in the autumn on my days off, wearing a professional blazer on top and pajama pants underneath. By November, I was one of the final candidates. The final decisions were promised by December. The only living soul who knew was Sarah, our charge nurse and my closest friend of 9 years. She kept my secret like a vault and asked about it in code at work, any cold breeze from the Highlands. So, while my mother was frosting her absolute certainty onto a bundt cake, I had a fragile maybe growing across an ocean, a maybe, that was all. But some nights, a maybe is the only thing standing between a woman and a basement. I refreshed my inbox one more time and went to sleep. The first proof of their plan arrived 10 days later, right in the middle of a shift. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. When I stepped out into the quiet hallway to answer, a pleasant voice said, "Miss Vance, this is the front office at Oak Ridge Academy. Leo has developed a high fever, and we haven't been able to reach his mother or father. You are listed as his secondary emergency contact." I blinked. "His what?" The woman repeated it patiently. "Secondary emergency contact. Right after the parents. Clara had listed me on the school forms that autumn. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had even bothered to tell me. You should know that it takes absolutely nothing to do that. A parent simply writes a name and a phone number on a piece of paper. No signature is required from the person being volunteered. There is no permission slip for the aunt. I traded my lunch break with a colleague, drove to the school, and collected a pale, shivering Leo who looked and felt miserable. I got him settled at his house with fever reducers and cartoons because none of this was his fault. As I was hanging his heavy backpack on the entryway hook, a folded sheet of paper fell out of the front pocket. It was a printed calendar grid created on a home computer, complete with cheerful clip art clouds in the corners. Across the top, in bold purple letters, it read Aunt Adrienne days, Tuesdays, Thursdays, alternating weekends. My name was blocked out on a calendar grid like a factory shift worker's. Weeks and weeks of my life, printed out and laminated with a small magnet on the back. I stood in my brother's hallway, holding that piece of paper, and I felt the floor beneath me give way. I checked the date printed in tiny font in the bottom corner, the day the file had been created, October. My mother hadn't even called me about the plan until the 3rd week of November. They had printed out my life a month before they ever mentioned it to me. The second proof found me in the grocery store aisle. It was early December by then. I was pushing a shopping cart through the cereal aisle after a long shift when Aunt Martha came around the corner and lit up like a porch light. She hugged me tightly, rocking me side to side, and whispered right into my ear, "We are all just so incredibly proud of you, Adrienne." I asked her what for, which was an honest question. Martha pulled back, beaming. Meredith told everyone at the community chapel, "You're taking a full sabbatical next year for the new baby, a whole year dedicated to family." Her eyes went shiny with tears. "You're a saint, honey." Reverend Thomas even mentioned your name during the intercession. I stood there between the oats and the granola bars while my aunt squeezed my hands, and I did not correct her. I want to be completely honest with you about why, because standing in that grocery aisle, I could already hear exactly how that correction would travel through the family network. It wouldn't be reported as Meredith was mistaken. No, it would travel as Adrienne backed out on the family. That very week, 2 more people stopped me. A woman from the church flower committee at the gas station, and an old family neighbor at the pharmacy. Both were glowing, both offered blessings, and both congratulated me on a major life decision I had never actually made. My mother had gone out ahead of me into every room I might ever stand in, and she had told my story first. So I called her. I kept my voice entirely level and said, "Mom, you cannot tell people I am quitting my job. I told you no." And my mother replied, warm as a heating pad, "Oh, honey, I was just so proud of you." Then, softer, with a tiny laugh that had no real humor in it, "You'll see, it will all feel completely natural once the baby arrives." I hung up and sat in silence. My mother had built me a cage out of public compliments, and she wasn't finished building yet. I decided it was time to tell them about Scotland. Not the official offer, which didn't exist yet, but the truth about the direction of my life. I rehearsed the words for 3 days in the shower, in the car, and at red lights. Just a simple, clear paragraph. I have applied for a clinical training fellowship overseas. I am a finalist. My answer regarding the nanny plan is no, and it will remain no, even if Scotland says no. Friday dinner at my parents' house. I arrived early. I deliberately helped with nothing, which actually took a great deal of effort. The moment finally came. Plates cleared. My father reaching for the television remote, my mother pouring decaf. I actually got the first sentence out. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something about next year." My mother set down the coffee pot and looked at me, and I swear some primal part of her already smelled the rebellion. Right at that exact second, Clara called the landline frantic. Toby had spiked a sudden, rapid fever and had suffered a febrile seizure on the kitchen floor. Everything after that was a blur of coats and headlights. I was at their house in 10 minutes because febrile seizures are terrifying to witness, but almost always harmless. And someone in that chaotic hallway needed to be the person who knew that. I checked him over, talked Clara down from her panic, and rode along to the urgent care clinic just in case. It was past midnight when we finally got back to the house, Toby asleep on my shoulder, heavy as a sandbag. In Julian's kitchen, my mother, who had driven over to manage the situation, looked around at the mess and said to the room in the voice of a closing argument, "You see, this is exactly why the plan makes sense. Some of us have families." Adrienne. Family takes care of family. It was the second time she had used that phrase that month. I drove home at 1 a.m. with my speech still folded up inside me, completely unsaid. Tell me something honestly in the comments. Have you ever rehearsed a sentence for days, only for life to repeatedly snatch the microphone out of your hand? Type THEPLAN in the comments if you know that exact feeling, and stay with me. Because what my father did next hurt worse than anything my mother had said out loud. The following Wednesday, my landlord, Frank, called me. Frank owns my building and plays golf with a local league that includes, among other retired men, my father. Frank's voice was warm and cooperative. "Adrienne, your dad mentioned you'd be moving back into the family home in the spring to help with the new grandbaby. He wanted to discuss the timing on your lease and whether you'd want to opt out early. It's awfully sweet of you, dear. They don't make daughters like that anymore." I stood in my kitchen, staring at my own reflection in the dark window, and heard myself calmly tell him that nothing was finalized yet and that I would call him back. Then I got into my car and drove straight to my parents' house. The 20-minute drive was spent focusing entirely on my breathing. I found my father in the garage, the radio playing quietly, sharpening lawnmower blades that didn't need sharpening. I asked him quietly if he had actually discussed terminating my lease with my landlord before anyone had asked me a single question. And my father, my sweet, conflict-averse father, rubbed the back of his neck, stared down at his workbench, and said, "Well, your mother said it was decided." That sentence sat heavily between us. Not we decided. Not even she decided, it was decided. Like the weather, like gravity, like an act of God. I looked at this man who had taught me how to drive, whom I had watched stand up to my mother maybe twice in my entire life, and I understood that he was never going to be the one to hand me my own future back. He was simply the man who painted whatever room my mother pointed at. "Dad," I said, "I am not moving into the attic." He nodded slowly, the exact way you nod at a small child who tells you they want to be an astronaut when they grow up. That nod did far more damage than a fist could have. Meanwhile, the toll for all of those family rescues was beginning to land squarely on my professional life. Between picking up Leo from school and the night of Toby's seizure, I had had to swap 2 major shifts in 3 weeks. And December in a neonatal intensive care unit is not a month with any room for error. Sarah caught me by the medicine cabinet, her arms crossed. Being confronted by Sarah is like being caught by bad weather. You don't realize how serious it is until you're in it. "Adrienne," she said, lowering her voice. "The nursing administration flagged those shift swaps. You know the clinical educator position is posting in the spring. You are the obvious, hands-down pick for it. But if you keep bleeding shifts every single time your family stubs a toe, someone with less experience but better attendance is going to get it." I started to explain, and she held up a hand. "It wasn't unkind. I know it's not your fault. It's never your fault, and yet it is always you." Then she said the sentence I have thought about 100 times since. "They are spending your career like it's their personal gift card." I went back to my station and stood over an incubator, watching a 2-pound baby boy breathe in and out, machine steady. And I thought about gift cards. I thought about how there is a finite number on them, and how everyone keeps swiping them as if there isn't. And then one day the card is declined and everyone acts completely shocked. For 11 years, I had built this career. Charge nurses specifically requested me. Terrified, grieving parents asked for me by name. And my family was carving it up into Tuesdays and Thursdays with clip art clouds in the corners. I finished my shift, sat in my car in the cold parking garage, and let my forehead rest on the steering wheel for exactly 1 minute. Then my phone buzzed against the cup holder. Not the group chat, and not my mother. The subject line of the email began with the exact phrase I had been praying toward for 10 months. Offer of appointment. I didn't open it in the car. I know how that sounds, but I had waited nearly a year, and some things you don't unwrap under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a parking garage. I walked back into the hospital, scanned my badge to enter the NICU supply room, and stood between the high shelves of preemie diapers and sterile saline flushes, the one place on earth where I've always known exactly who I am. Then I opened the email from Dr. Alastair Fraser. Dear Miss Vance, on behalf of the selection committee, I am delighted to offer you the appointment of pediatric resuscitation training specialist in Edinburgh, a 2-year contract, a real competitive salary listed in British pounds, complete with a relocation allowance and a settling in stipend for my first month. The hospital would fully sponsor my work visa. Nurses with my specialization are on Scotland's critical skills shortage list, which is a formal way of saying they need us faster than they can train them. My professional registration paperwork, filed back in the autumn, was already in process. The start date was March 15th, which meant flying out by March 5th. I had exactly 12 weeks to dismantle my entire life and build a brand new one across the ocean. I read the letter 3 times. My hands were shaking so violently that the rows of tiny diapers blurred, and I actually laughed at myself. 11 years of keeping steady hands during medical emergencies, and here I was, trembling like a first-year nursing student. I didn't sign it that night. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned. I created a hidden folder on my phone specifically for this. The offer letter, the contract waiting to be signed, and the airline booking page with a 1-way flight to Edinburgh already in the shopping cart. When my thumb hovered over the prompt asking me to name the folder, I didn't type Scotland or Edinburgh, New Life. I typed 6 capital letters EVELYN. Then I stood in that supply room a little longer, listening to the hum of the ventilation system. All I had to do was sign. So why were my hands still shaking? I think you already know why. The folder had her name on it. And I still hadn't told you what grandmother EVELYN had actually given me. Here is what EVELYN left me. It was the last truly clear night she had about a month before the end. She sent me to her bedroom dresser to find the old metal tin where she kept loose buttons and dead batteries. She made me dig out an old wristwatch. It had a small, scratched face, a leather band that had gone as soft as a worn dollar bill, and it ran exactly 5 minutes slow. Always had. She pressed it firmly into my palm and folded my fingers over it with both of her hands, which took a great deal of effort for her by then. And she told me a story I had never heard in 33 years. She told me that once, long before any of us existed, she had been accepted into a prestigious art program in Boston. She was 19, with a portfolio full of birds she had sketched from her kitchen window. She never went. Her mother needed her, then her brothers needed her, then a husband, then her own children, and then those children's children. I kept waiting for someone to tell me it was finally my turn, she said. Her voice wasn't bitter, which was the hardest part to hear. It was just incredibly tired and certain, like an old road sign. Nobody ever did, Adrienne. Nobody ever hands a woman her turn. You have to take it. Then she tapped the watch with one knuckle and told me she kept it 5 minutes slow on purpose so that every single time she checked it, she would remember that time does not wait politely for you. I wore that watch to her funeral, running 5 minutes slow, while the minister praised my mother's devotion. I was wearing it in that supply room 3 years later, the night the offer arrived. So that is what I did, standing between the diapers and the Celine. I looked down at her watch. Then I opened the folder named EVELYN, signed the contract with my thumb, purchased the one-way ticket, put my phone in my pocket, and went back to finish my shift. My hands were still shaking. I signed it anyway. That is the entire secret if you want it. You don't wait until you are steady. You sign while you are shaking. I fully intended to tell my family that week. I had the printed offer letter folded up in my purse like a passport. My plan was simple-y, sit my parents down alone in a calm adult-to-adult setting. I drove over to their house on a Saturday in January, completely prepared and rehearsed. But my mother met me at the door, her eyes absolutely blazing with joy. She grabbed my sleeve and said, "Perfect timing. Come see what your father did." She led me up the stairs to the attic. They had cleared the entire space out. My father's storage bins and old suitcases were gone. The old wooden paneling had a fresh coat of paint, a soft, delicate sage green, against the far wall. Neatly made up with a floral quilt I recognized from my childhood bedroom, stood my old twin bed, my high school dresser, a small lamp, and new curtains hung over the window. My mother stood in the center of the room with her arms outstretched like a game show model. "It will be just like having our little girl back home," she said, her voice wobbling with genuine emotion. "And that is the detail I need you to sit with." It was real. She wasn't performing. My father stood on the stairs behind us, holding a paintbrush he hadn't actually needed for days, smiling, hopeful, and incredibly proud of that sage green paint. They had built the cage lovingly. That is what I keep trying to explain to people. It was a beautiful, loving cage with my own childhood bed waiting inside it. I stood there with the offer letter burning a hole in my purse, and I understood, cold and clear as tap water, what would happen if I announced Scotland right then and there. I would face 3 weeks of endless family phone calls, interventions, and tears deployed against me before I ever reached an airport. My mother wanted a grand audience for my future. Fine, she would get one. Before we get to that final dinner, I owe you my brother's perspective fair and square. In late January, Julian showed up at my apartment to return a ceramic casserole dish, which was a terrible excuse because Julian never returns anything. He stood in my doorway, nervously turning his baseball cap around in his hands, and said, "Look, you don't actually have to do this. The nanny thing." For one brief second, the hallway lit up. I thought I had an ally, one human being inside the fence who actually saw me. I opened my mouth to tell him everything Edinburgh, the contract, the flight, but he beat me by half a breath. "But Adrienne, it really would save us, I mean it. Clara is completely drowning. Daycare for the kids is more than my entire paycheck. And you," he shrugged, gesturing vaguely at my quiet, tidy apartment. My single coffee cup drying on the rack, my compact self-contained life. You're free. Free. I want you to sit with that word for a minute, the way I have. He didn't mean free in the sense of liberty. He meant available. He meant costless. In my family, those had always been treated as the exact same word, and he didn't even realize he was saying it. That is how you know a deeply held belief has finished becoming part of the household furniture. My brother is not a villain. I want that understood. He is a tired man with 4 kids and a 5th on the way, trying to do desperate financial calculations in the dark. And long ago, someone taught him that his sister was a number he could always carry the remainder to. I didn't tell him about Scotland. I just looked at him and said, I am not free, Julian. I have never once been free. You have just never bothered to look at the bill. He blinked at me as if I had spoken Portuguese, thanked me for the dish, and left. I closed the door and stood with my back pressed against it. My last potential ally had folded before I could even lay my cards down. The summons went out during the last week of January, delivered through the family group chat with digital tulip emojis. Sunday, February 8th. A family dinner to celebrate our newest blessing and finalize the childcare arrangements. My mother writes multiple exclamation points the way other people load shotguns. Everyone was commanded to appear: Julian, Clara, all 4 children, Aunt Martha, and Uncle Kenneth. My mother sent a follow-up text directly to me. Come at 3:00 to prep the garlic roast chicken, since yours is the one everyone loves. Of course she did. I sat on my sofa that night with 2 entirely different futures stretched out in front of me, and I looked at them honestly for the very last time. In one future, a soft sage green attic room, a laminated calendar of my life, and everyone at the community chapel calling me a saint until the day they buried me. 5 minutes slow. In the other, a folder in my phone named EVELYN. A signed contract, a one-way ticket for March 5th, only 3 weeks away. 12 years of keeping other people's babies alive traded up for teaching an entire country's nurses to do the exact same. I checked the gold watch. I checked the digital folder. Both were still ticking. Before we walk into that dining room together, I want to ask you one serious question. Have you ever been the one your family labels the free one, the sister with nothing major going on, the daughter who doesn't have anything to rush home to, the aunt whose entire life is expected to fit inside other people's emergencies? Type the word AFAR in the comments. I want my mother's algorithm to see exactly how many of us are out there. All right, Sunday, 14 plates set on the table. 2 major announcements coming, the one they had carefully planned for me and the one waiting silently in my coat pocket. Deep breath. Let's go to dinner. But first, during the week leading up to that Sunday, I quietly and thoroughly burned my boats. On Monday, I called Frank myself before my father could do any more helping, and gave formal notice on my apartment for the end of February. He was gracious but highly confused, since the story he had been sold by my father involved me moving into an attic, not moving across the Atlantic. I let the confusion stand. On Tuesday, a representative from an international moving company walked through my rooms, placed inventory stickers on the few pieces of furniture worth shipping, and quoted me a delivery date. On Wednesday, I sat in the human resources office at the hospital and slid my formal resignation letter across the desk. A standard 30 days notice. My last shift would be February 28th. Every single box was checked, because I was not going to let anyone say I had left my fragile babies short-staffed on a whim and won. And on Thursday, Sarah took her break at the exact same time as mine. She read the flight confirmation email over my shoulder in the quiet stairwell, burst into sudden tears, laughed at herself, hugged me tightly, and said, "Edinburgh has absolutely no idea what is about to land on them. I want you to notice what all of this actually means, because it is the hinge upon which everything turns." By the time that Sunday dinner arrived, there was no version of the future where I stayed in Massachusetts. The lease was terminated. The movers were booked. The resignation was submitted. Grandmother Evelyn's watch ticked 5 minutes, slow on my wrist. And in my mind, her voice kept perfect time with it. Nobody hands a woman her turn. You have to take it. So when I walked into my mother's dining room, I was not coming to ask for their permission. I was coming to deliver the news. One more thing happened that week, and I have gone back and forth about whether to share it, because it was the only time in this entire process that I nearly lost my nerve. On Thursday evening, I stopped by my parents' house to return a roasting pan, armor on, in and out, 90 seconds max. But the kitchen was empty, and I found my mother sitting at the dining table alone with an old photo album open. She didn't hear me walk in. She was staring intensely at a photograph of a young woman in a vintage nursing student's uniform, complete with a starched white cap. It took me a moment to realize the young woman was her. "You've never seen these, have you?" she said softly, not startled by my presence and not looking up. And then my mother told me in a flat, matter-of-fact tone a story I had never once heard in 33 years. She had been in nursing school. She had left the program at 23 when Julian was on the way because back then, that is simply what you did. And then her mother-in-law, EVELYN's direct opposite, a cold and difficult woman, suffered a major stroke. For 6 long years, my mother had bathed her, fed her, and turned her in bed in this exact house while trying to raise 2 young children. 6 years, she said quietly, her thumb smoothing the plastic protective page of the album. And on the day of her funeral, your father's family lined up to thank the minister for his kindness to them. I used to go into the pantry and cry so that nobody would have to see it. I stood there in my winter coat, holding a metal roasting pan, looking at my mother truly for the very first time. I saw a woman whom the family machine had eaten first, decades before she ever fed her own daughter to it. I almost spoke. I almost put my arms around her. And then she closed the album, patted the cover twice, and looked up at me with absolute, serene conviction. "That is what the women in this family do," she said. "You'll understand when it's your turn." And there it was. Her own deep wound hadn't taught her mercy. It had taught her that the wound itself was a uniform, and she was the one in charge of the fittings. My very last shift that Friday was the kind of day that makes this entire career make sense. The baby girl from October, the 25-weeker who weighed under 2 pounds when I met her, was finally going home. After 4 months of machines, setbacks, and a slow crawl forward, she left the building in a car seat that completely swallowed her. Wearing a tiny knit hat with a pom-pom larger than her fist, her mother stood in front of me in the clinical hallway, tried to make a thank you speech, and simply couldn't. Finally, she just gripped my hand tightly on the handle of the car seat and whispered, "You are the reason I get to take my daughter home." I keep a small collection of sentences that people have said to me over the years, the way other women keep fine jewelry. That sentence is my diamond. The unit threw me a small farewell party in the break room. Someone had hung a paper banner that read, "Edinburgh's Gain." Underneath it, in thick black marker, Sarah had written, "And Boston's Loss." Don't you forget it. I cleaned out my locker. 11 years of my life fit into a single brown paper, bagged 2 favorite coffee mugs, a stethoscope, and a drawing Chloe had made for me of a bird wearing a nurse's cap. Driving home, I took the long route, which I almost never do. The long route happens to pass my parents' street. The house sat there in the winter dark, the front porch light on, and low along the foundation, glowing through the cellar window wells, was the light of the attic room. Shining soft sage green even from the road. 2 completely different definitions of a real life, only 1 block apart. In one window, a banner made by people who had watched me work. In the other, a twin bed made by people who had watched me my entire life, but had never once actually seen me. Sunday was 2 days away, and I still didn't know exactly what I would say at that table. As it turned out, I didn't need a speech. My mother had already written one for me. On Saturday, I took Chloe to the public library. It was a standing date we had kept since she was 5 years old. But this time, we did something new. We got her very first library card. She signed her name on the line with her tongue pressed between her teeth, pressing so hard she slightly tore the paper. The librarian laminated it while she watched, transfixed, as if it were a historic event. Afterward, we sat at a wooden table by the atlas stand. Chloe, who is 7 and notices everything, slowly spun the globe and said, "Show me your favorite place." I placed her small finger on Massachusetts, and then I walked her finger across the blue Atlantic Ocean slowly and set it down on the coast of Scotland. "That's really far," she whispered. "It is," I said. She stared at the globe for a long time, keeping her finger pressed firmly on Edinburgh, as if she were holding it down for me, saving my seat. Then she looked up at me with those observant eyes and asked, "Will you still know me?" I had to look away at the atlas stand for a second to catch my breath. And then I told her the absolute truth, which is the only thing I have ever been willing to give that child. "Every single place I go," I said, "I will know you. That is a nurse's promise. We aren't allowed to break those." She nodded, very business-like, and stamped the back of my hand with the library's date, stamper when the librarian wasn't looking, so that I would have proof. I still have the faded blue smudge preserved in a photo on my phone. Here is why I am telling you this. Whatever happened at that dining table on Sunday, I knew those 4 children were going to be told a version of me that I did not write. I had one single afternoon to leave a truer, permanent version of myself behind, sealed and laminated in the one young heart most likely to keep it safe. Sunday, February 8th. I arrived at my parents' house at 3 o'clock, exactly as instructed, and I prepared the garlic. Roast chicken exactly as instructed. I want to be completely honest about why. It wasn't obedience, it was ceremony. I stood in the kitchen, where I had made myself useful my entire life, and I brined, buttered, and roasted that bird for 14 people. I did it the way you lay flowers down on a grave, deliberately, for the very last time, as a free gift rather than a bill being paid. The house filled up with noise behind me. Uncle Kenneth arrived first, as he always does, and immediately took up his position in front of the television. Aunt Martha brought her cranberry, pecan fluff salad that absolutely nobody eats, but everyone politely praises. Julian's family arrived at 5 like a sudden storm. Backpacks, spill-proof cups, Leo narrating his drawings, Toby spinning, Maeve climbing, and Chloe immediately slipping away to find me in the kitchen to proudly show off her new library card in its own special pocket. My mother orchestrated the entire room from the head of the dining table, radiant, wearing her best gold earrings, the ones reserved only for major occasions. My father carried an extra folding chairs and opened the sparkling apple cider. Julian's family doesn't drink, and he lined up the glasses like little soldiers. 14 place settings, including mine. The good crystal stemware I had helped move back in October. Cloth napkins. And then I saw it, at my place setting, leaned neatly against my water glass the way a menu waits at a restaurant, sat a bound packet. It was about 20 pages long with a spiral spine and a clear plastic cover. Clara-specific computer font, clip art clouds. The cover read, in cheerful purple capital letters, the Vance Family Collective Care Registry. There was a physical divider tab inside with my name on it. I stared at it the way you would stare at your own obituary, printed early and placed right next to your fork. I did not touch it. I sat down, smiled at Chloe across the table, and felt the solid weight of the phone in my pocket against my hip, patient as a stone. The glasses were filled. Here we go. The dinner rolled along on its usual tracks. The chicken was praised, the children were fed, and Uncle Kenneth told his one recurring story about the runaway lawnmower. And then, during dessert, my mother stood up and gently tapped her glass with a spoon. The table went quiet the way it always does for her. She had prepared remarks. God gives every family exactly what they need. She began, her hand resting over her heart, and she offered a beautiful toast to Julie and Clara. And the new life expected in June. Everyone raised their glasses of sparkling cider, and it was truly lovely. I raised my glass too. But she didn't sit down. She beamed at the room, unfolding her notes like a sermon. But God also provides the help. Which brings us to our second major announcement. She turned directly to me, gesturing with her arm, presenting me to my own family like a prize behind a curtain. Starting in March, our Adrienne will be stepping away from the hospital and moving back into the house. Your father did the attic. Wait until you see it. To become this family's full-time caregiver. All 5 babies, 1 devoted aunt. She actually received applause. Aunt Martha clapped warmly. Clara, glowing with relief, reached over and slid the spiral, bound packet closer to my plate, whispering that page 4 contained my weekly schedule grid. My father raised his glass to me, proud, hopeful, and already toasting my sacrifice. I set my glass down on the table. "Mum," I said, keeping my voice level and pleasant. "We've talked about this. I have a career. I have a life." The clapping trailed off. My mother, still standing, still smiling, still warm as an August afternoon, tilted her head at me with genuine, bottomless fondness and said, "Oh, sweetheart, you don't really have a real life anyway. No husband, no babies of your own, that little apartment. This is us giving you one. Let me tell you something." Nobody in that room flinched. Aunt Martha studied her cranberry fluff. Uncle Kenneth watched the muted television screen. My father topped off the nearest glass of cider like a man bailing out a sinking boat 1 teaspoon at a time. My entire family sat there in perfect, comfortable agreement that my life was a vacant lot they had finally found a useful purpose for. I smiled. I actually smile because I had 3 weeks. That is why. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. I unlocked it under the table. One tap opened the folder named EVELYN. I stood up, mirroring the way my mother was standing, and I turned the screen outward toward the room. I set the phone down in the exact center of the table, face up between the cranberry fluff and the chicken carcass, slow and gentle, like laying down a winning hand you aren't even proud of. "Before you laminate anything else," I said quietly, "you should see this." My contract filled the screen. The official hospital crest at the header. Edinburgh, the words, "Pediatric Resuscitation Training Specialist," and my signature clearly visible, dated 3 weeks prior. I swiped the screen once to display my airline booking confirmation. One way, Boston to Edinburgh, March 5th, exactly 21 days from that dinner. Nobody moved, I mean that almost clinically. 14 place settings, and not a single sound in that room except for little Maeve, 2 years old, rhythmically tapping her spoon on her high chair tray, the only honest beat in the entire house. Aunt Martha's fork remained suspended over her plate. Clara's hand lay flat on the spiral packet, as if she were taking its pulse. Julian leaned in, read the text on the screen, and went completely pale. My father looked directly at my mother, which is what my father does instead of having an actual reaction. So I said the rest of it. I kept my voice the way I keep it during a cardiac code, low, slow, and purely procedural. I have accepted a 2-year post in Scotland, training pediatric nurses to save lives. I have signed the contract. I have given notice on my apartment. Friday was my very last shift at the hospital. I fly out in 3 weeks. I looked around at the frozen faces at the table and then down at the purple packet by my plate. The plan you printed has one major flaw. I was never yours to schedule. The room remained frozen for 1 more second, maybe 2. And then I watched my mother's face do something I had never seen it do in 33 years. It went from solid marble to water. Her chin trembled, and her eyes filled with tears right there over her good china, in front of her sister and her grandchildren. And then she said the one thing in this world I had absolutely no armor against. Not a scream, something far worse. She said it softly. "You would actually leave this family," she whispered, "over a job." That was the soft blow, and it landed precisely where soft things do, deep under the ribs. Then the room thawed all at once, and everything happened on top of everything else. Clara burst into real heavy tears. Exhaustion has a very specific sound, and I know it well. She cried out, "How could you do this to the baby?" A baby, I would like the record to show, who did not yet exist, and who already outranked me in value. Julian said absolutely nothing. He sat there nervously pleating the edge of the tablecloth between his fingers, staring at my signature on the screen, as if it were a horrific accident. My father took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly on his shirt, and muttered to no one, "Scotland. That's an ocean away," as if the primary issue were merely geographical. My mother cycled rapidly through her emotional arsenal right in front of me, weapon by weapon, while I stood there and watched it unfold in slow motion. First, the dismissive laugh. "This is just a phase. You'll be back home by the summer." Then the prosecutor, who applies for jobs overseas behind their family's back. Who does that? Sneaking around for a year as if we're total strangers. Then the moral authority, her hand flat on the table. "Charity begins at home. Adrienne, it begins at home." And me. I gave her the only thing I had left, which was brevity. "It's signed," I said. "It's paid for. It's done." 3 small, flat stones cast into all that churning water. That was when Uncle Kenneth, who had not uttered a single word since the lawnmower story, muted the television, turned around in his chair, and said, "Meredith, let the girl speak." God bless Uncle Kenneth, because the next thing my mother attempted wasn't louder. It was far smarter, and it very nearly worked. But first, since Kenneth had bought me the floor, I used it to speak for 15 years of silence. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, and I didn't perform. I spoke plainly, like a patient discharge summary. Since you all believe I don't have a real life, let me tell you exactly where it went. 4 years of it went to grandmother EVELYN. Every single evening, every single weekend, every hospital run, while this family called me once a week to check on her progress as if she were a package being delivered. Aunt Martha flinched at that. She knew the truth of it. The last 3 years went to Julian's children. The midnight fevers, the school pickups, the seizure. The weekends I took all 4 of them so that the 2 of you could remember what each other's faces looked like. I did it entirely out of love, and I would do most of it again. But every single person sitting at this table filed my time under free. I picked up the spiral, bound packet with my name on the tab, and placed it back down in front of Clara, gently, like returning a borrowed item. You listed me at Leo's school without ever asking. You printed out a schedule of my life in October. Before a single one of you had even said the word please, Dad spoke to my landlord. Mom told the entire chapel. My entire future was planned out in this house, at this table. And now I have one question, and I would like an honest answer. I looked around the table at all of them, letting the silence stretch out, and then I asked it, in 15 years. Did even one of you, one single time, ask me what I wanted? Nothing. The furnace hummed. Maeve's spoon had finally stopped. Chloe was looking from face to adult face, performing calculations that no 7-year-old should ever have to do. That's exactly what I thought, I said. And the words came out gentler than I had expected, because the silence in the room was sadder than I had anticipated. Family takes care of family. I agree with you, Mom. I have been doing exactly that for 15 years. I was just never included in the family that actually gets taken care of. My mother folded her linen napkin very slowly, carefully pressing down each crease. When she finally looked up, her eyes had completely changed. The storm was gone, replaced by something incredibly patient. And it terrified me far more than the shouting had. Adrienne, she said softly. Her voice went as smooth as bathwater. Sit down, please. Sweetie, I remained standing, but something inside me instinctively leaned toward that voice, which is the absolute truth, because I had been waiting my entire life to hear it. You are right, she said. The table gasped in its own quiet way, chairs shifting, Martha's hand flying to her throat. We should have asked you. We got ahead of ourselves. That is entirely my fault, and I am admitting it in front of everyone. She spread her hands open, humble, reasonable, her eyes still wet. So, let's fix it the right way. 1 year. That is all we ask. Stay for 1 year, until the baby is steady on her feet and Clara is back on hers. And then you go to Scotland, and you go with our full support. Her voice cracked slightly. Whether on purpose or not, I will never know. You go with our blessing. We'll throw you a proper send-off at the chapel. Your father will drive you to the airport himself. The entire family will be there waving you off, incredibly proud of you. Just please don't leave us like this, in anger with everything broken. Don't you want to leave the right way? And my father, who had not asked me a personal question since I was a teenager, said quietly, We'll finally do it right, kiddo. Aunt Martha let out a long breath, like a jury that had just reached a verdict. I want to be dead honest with you about that specific moment, because this is where the entire story lives, not on the screen of the phone. Everything I had ever wanted from these people was sitting right there on that table, beautifully wrapped, to be asked, to be thanked, to be blessed on my way out the door, to be missed. All I had to do was hand them 1 more year of my life, and I could finally buy the exact love I had spent 15 years working for. Every eye in the room was on me. Chloe's eyes were on me. EVELYN's watch was ticking on my wrist, 5 minutes slow. That is how a whole life gets 5 minutes behind, and then a year behind, and then 40 years. I stood there, and I actually felt my head begin to nod. And then I saw it, the flaw in the diamond, the truth my body already knew. A blessing you have to buy is not a blessing. It is simply an invoice with a bow on top. And there would always be just 1 more year. The baby would need to walk. And then Maeve would need kindergarten. And then my mother's knees would finally give out. The family machine would keep finding reasons, because that is exactly what the machine is built to do. I knew it because a young woman in an old photo album had once waited 6 years in a kitchen pantry for a thank you that never came, and then she had called that waiting holy and passed the duty down to me. No, I said. The word came out quiet, solid, and complete. My mother blinked. No, not in June, not in a year, and not the right way. Because, Mom, there was never going to be a right way for me to leave. Only a paid way. I picked up my phone from the table. EVELYN's watch caught the light, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than it had any right to be. And you were wrong about one thing tonight. I do have a real life. You have just never once asked to see it." Then I walked around the table. Because the clock on the rest of my time there had officially run out, I kissed Leo's hair mid-protest. I hugged Toby, who hugs with his entire body even when he doesn't understand why. I kissed Maeve's little hand, and I crouched down next to Chloe's chair and looked her straight in the eyes. "A letter every single month," I promised. "A nurse's promise?" She nodded, her chin trembling, and pressed her thumb firmly against my hand because the actual library stamp was gone. I grabbed my coat. Behind me, my mother stood up so quickly her wooden chair shrieked against the floor. Her voice finally broke wide open, and what poured out was the very last card in her deck, the oldest one there is. "If you get on that plane," she said, shaking with anger, "don't you dare call this house your home anymore." The room made a collective sound, like a sharp breath being drawn in. I stopped at the doorway for 1 second. I turned around and looked at my mother, furious, terrified, wet-eyed, dressed in her best occasion earrings. The machine's most dedicated worker and its oldest casualty. "Then I will write to the people in it who still call me family," I said. And then I walked out of my parents' front door into the cold February air, and absolutely nobody followed me. And that right there was the price. And I paid it in full. And it was still the absolute best trade I have ever made in my life. I sat in my car at the curb for a long time before I could bring myself to drive. The dining room window glowed with a warm gold light behind the curtains, and I could see the outlines of shapes moving inside. My entire family, still in there, gathered around the chicken I had cooked for them. "The world's warmest closed door," I cried once, heavily for about 90 seconds, my hands holding the steering wheel at 10 and 2. As if I were steering myself through a storm. It was grief, not regret. And yes, there is a massive difference between the two. That night, I finally learned that difference in my own body. You can be entirely certain and completely heartbroken at the exact same time. Both feelings all the way. Then I wiped my face with my coat sleeve, looked down at grandmother Evelyn's watch, and did something I had been meaning to do for 3 years. Nothing. I left it 5 minutes slow, exactly as she had kept it, because I finally understood the setting. It was never actually measuring time. It was measuring the cost of waiting for someone else's permission. I pulled away from the curb, watching the porch light shrink in my rearview mirror. The road ahead of me ran straight to March 5th. On March 5th, I flew. Nobody from my family came to the airport, and I had already made peace with that at the curb 3 weeks prior. Sarah drove me. She cried at security, threatened the TSA agent with a fierce hug, and texted me a photo of my own plane taking off. Edinburgh, I will be honest, tested me at first. It rained sideways for 11 straight days. I knew absolutely nobody. My flat came with a basic electric kettle and a deep silence that I had to learn like a foreign language. It turns out that when you have been desperately needed every single hour for 15 years, quiet feels like you are falling at first. And then, my very first training day arrived. A lecture hall full of pediatric nurses and midwives stood up when I walked into the room. And there was my name written on the schedule board, Miss Vance, lead training specialist. Paid, printed, asked for. I teach hands now. Dozens of pairs of hands that will go on to hold thousands of small, fragile lives. That is the kind of math I can actually live inside. News from Massachusetts arrived in small pieces, almost entirely through Julian, who began texting me about 2 weeks after I arrived. Short, tentative messages, mostly photographs. The baby arrived in the middle of June, a healthy, loud little girl. Both mother and daughter did wonderfully. Clara hired part-time help 3 days a week, and wonder of wonders, the sky did not fall. It turned out that "we have no other option" had only ever meant "we have no other free option. My mother has not called." She told the community chapel that I had abandoned the family in their hour of need, and some of them believed her. Aunt Martha, I am told, has gone noticeably quiet whenever the subject of my departure comes up, which for Martha is the equivalent of a protest march. And every single month, like clockwork, a letter arrives from Chloe, printed carefully and hard, the handwriting getting slightly smaller and neater as the year goes on. And then, one evening in June, Julian sent a photograph that sat me straight down on my kitchen floor. It was a picture of the new baby, red-faced, furious, and absolutely beautiful. Underneath it, he had typed, "Her middle name is Evelyn." It has been over a year now since that Sunday dinner. On Saturday mornings, after my early shift, I walk home along the chilly bay with a hot coffee, and at noon my phone rings for my standing video call. Chloe reads her library books to me, her own card, her own stack of books. Leo narrates whatever video game he is currently conquering. Toby presses his eye directly against the camera lens because he honestly believes that is how you hug someone through a phone. Julian leans into the camera frame most weeks and makes embarrassing, brotherly remarks about my developing Scottish accent. And once, from somewhere off camera, I heard Clara's voice, awkward but entirely real, say, "Tell your aunt thank you." I had to look out the window at the gray water for a moment. My father sends postcards. The last one featured a historic lighthouse and a message written in his careful, mechanical print, "Proud of you. Don't tell your mother." I laughed until I wasn't laughing anymore. Because no, my mother hasn't called. Maybe she never will. But here is the fundamental change I can report from the far side of the ocean. I can live with that. Not happily, to be honest. There is a difference there. 2. The family machine still runs in that house, and it still tells its specific story at church, but it runs entirely without me now. And the youngest woman in that family is named after the one who told me to take my turn. EVELYN's watch is on my wrist right now, running 5 minutes slow. In the middle of a life that finally runs on time. If you take only one thing from my story, let it be this. A family that only loves you for what you can carry will call it love right up until the exact day you finally set the weight down. And the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who help you set it down. That is the entire lesson. It cost me a blessing I never actually needed, and it bought me a life I actually get to live. A 5th baby, a printed schedule, an attic room with my old bed in it, and one phone lying face up on my mother's dining table. If anyone has ever tried to tell you that you don't have a real life, hear me. From a rainy coast 3,000 miles past that dining room, you do. It is just waiting for you to sign your name to it. If this story found you on a night you desperately needed to hear it, please subscribe to their secret stories and share it with a friend who is currently holding everyone else's weight. And tell me in the comments, because I read them with my coffee by the bay, what is your one-way ticket?